it going, friends? Welcome back to the Church Word Podcast. I'm Pastor Nick, and I am pastor of the First Baptist Church of Palos Verdes in the South Bay area of California, that is specifically Los Angeles. And here on the Church Word Podcast, we talk ever so slightly about post-sermon, post-church, and post-cultural thoughts on the text of the day and of what is going on in reality right outside. So thank you for being here. If you like what you hear here, make sure to subscribe and like this video and this channel, and we'll see it grow. So it's really cool. So thank you. Something I focused on today at First Baptist Palos Verdes was the phrase "For God is near," and it's from Philippians chapter 4, verses 4 through 9. But in a key phrase in there it's very short, but it's that aforementioned "For God is near." And often we might think of this as Paul in his incarcerated state trying to convey to the church that God takes notice of what they do, right? And we might think of nearness here as being something along the lines of perhaps Santa Claus, right? That he's keeping a list, he's checking it twice, going to make sure, who's naughty and nice. And while there are aspects of that are true, that God is holy, God is just, God is aware of these things, especially the things that we do. In the case of this text, it indicates something different. Remember that Paul, as I mentioned, is incarcerated, he's in prison, who knows what he's eating or drinking or his state, but it's certainly not a pleasant place to be. And for Paul to tell the church, and thus us today, to be rejoicing and to be engaged in gentleness and have the same mind as Christ, should give us, I think, great pause in how we think about things. And I think the hardest part about the text, or at least the specific phrase, "God is near," is that it really is disquieting. In an American society or a culture, nearness is often either perhaps it's sexualized, it's disconcerting, it's uncomfortable, especially when, in this case, God as perfectly holy, perfectly loving, as some say, a maximally great being, in philosophical terms. This God is eternal in love, eternal in power, eternal in holiness, and all those sorts of things. And so much so that we often forget that for God to draw near often has the implication, unintended, of us feeling very small. When perfection comes to you in the form of God, you're left going like, wow, you get, I think, a distinct sense of unworthiness. And I think for a lot of people, specifically kind of my age and their late 30s and younger, specifically the younger generation, like Zoomers or Gen Alpha, I think the issue will not be that God is all these things, powerful, loving, good, mighty, sovereign, blah, blah, blah. It's that I think we're beginning to see a sea change in how we think about God and how we relate to God. Because there is this, I think, incipient supernaturalism in the world that younger people are beginning to really recognize, kind of the old guard of scientism and stuff like that. It's just kind of going by the wayside. I think you're seeing a lot more people seeking God in ways that other generations didn't. There's an earnestness, there's a desire, there's a longing, specifically in the time of Advent, a longing for God's presence and God's nearness. And I think if we capture what Paul says and we think about perhaps the famous story from the Old Testament, the burning bush and Moses, you see this really interesting bit about how God tells him not to run away from his presence, but to take off your shoes, for where you stand is holy ground or sacred ground. And Moses, of course, does that. And he gets, of course, closer to God and draws near. But in that instance, we think God, came very close and asked Moses to step closer to him. And so perhaps the way we need to rethink nearness, the nearness of God, is not thinking just about the things we do or don't do, although those are vital for Christian faith and holiness and sanctification, but that God's presence is something that must be pursued on our end as well. That God is near, but that also is a demand upon us to rejoice and to engage in the transformation of mind and heart in hope that we will begin to see Jesus more clearly. We will begin to feel his presence more earnestly. And what was far away has become very, very close. And of course, the message of Christmas and of Advent is that God became so close that he became like us in every way except without sin, taking the form of a slave, born of a woman, born under the law, so that he might redeem many sons for glory. And so perhaps the nearness of God is not just in his presence, but also in what he has done for us, the things that we could never imagine or hope to do that God did for us. And in that sense, I think, all right, go ahead, Nolan. Go on out. We'll do it in a minute. Okay? Yes. 1 second, everyone. Yeah? Go ahead. Go.
Do I need a drink?
Do you need a drink? Yeah. Well, go grab your cup and get yourself some water, and then I'll get you some juice after, okay? Give me a minute, okay?
I need juice.
Well, you can have juice after you take a sip of water. I need you to get hydrated so you don't get sick from sugar, okay? Go on. I love you. Go on.
Oh, there's a cup here.
Oh, take your cup and shut my door after me, please. And go get some water, and I'll come out in a moment. And speaking of presence and nearness, I think ultimately that's kind of how God actually acts. God, kind of in the form of my son, kicks open the door and confronts us with an actual desire that he has. In the case of the incarnation, it is, I am the object of faith. I am the healer of your souls. I am the balm of Gilead. I am the one who draws ever near to you. And I expect you, not in perfection, that comes later, to draw near to me in response and in holiness. And so for the Christian during the time of Advent and of Christmas, we remember that God loved us so much that he came here in the form of a child to be nursed by us, to be cared for by us, to be cleaned by us, as seen as his mother cared for him, as Mary did. And so I think for us as Christians, we must remember that God's presence is not just something we're meant to feel, it is something we're meant to live into. And that live means we do everything in holiness and in love and in tenderness and in gentleness towards others, not considering our own needs, although not denying them, but not considering them, but considering the needs of others. Putting others at top of mind, perhaps, would be the way to say it. So that is why I think the phrase God is near is so important, because it forces us to recognize that God's presence is not something that can be bottled or contained, but must be accepted and welcomed and thus embodied. That because of the love of Christ and the love of the Father and the Spirit, we too can walk in newness of life, knowing that he is with us no matter what we do. Even when times are difficult, when we're lonely, when we're anxious, God loved us so much that he sent his Son into the world, not to condemn us, but that through his Son the world might be saved. And we are saved in part because of his presence, that is the gift of his Son. So thank you for listening or watching. May the Lord be with you. May the Lord bless you. If you're looking for a church home, consider 28 Moccasin Lane, Rolling Hills Estates, California, up in the South Bay area where Long Beach is, and Torrance. We worship. Nolan, can you say Merry Christmas to people?
Merry Christmas.
Thank you. And we worship at 11 a.m. on Sunday mornings. Go ahead and go play with those. Say Merry Christmas again to everyone.
Merry Christmas.
Thank you. All right. Y'all have a good one. God bless. And I will see you next week on the Church Word Podcast.